You keep stopping right before the breakthrough. Here's why, the pattern you never manage to name. Most people believe they stop when things go wrong. When the project collapses, when the relationship breaks, when the numbers don't work, when life pushes back hard enough that stopping feels like the only rational response. That's the story most people tell themselves, and it's not entirely wrong. But it's not the whole truth either. Because if you stop and look honestly, not at the moments you failed, but at the moments you stopped, you'll notice something that doesn't fit that story. The times that cost you the most weren't the times you fell. They were the times you were getting up. The third week of a discipline that was finally holding. The project that was gaining real traction for the first time. The version of yourself that was becoming real, not as an idea anymore, but as something you could actually feel in your body, in your decisions, in the way you were starting to move through the world. And then you stopped. Not because something broke, because something was working. That distinction matters more than almost anything else this video will cover. Because as long as you believe you stop when things go wrong, you'll keep trying to fix your resilience, your motivation, your discipline, and the pattern will keep repeating. Quietly in the same place every time. There's a specific moment, and most people who've lived this recognize it immediately when it's described, where the internal atmosphere shifts. Here it's not dramatic, it doesn't announce itself. One day you're moving, building, accumulating, and something underneath begins to slow. Not your energy, not your clarity. Something older than both of those, something that doesn't speak in words but starts generating reasons. Logical ones, compelling ones, reasons to wait, to reconsider, to be careful, to not rush, to be realistic. And the most disorienting part is that those reasons don't feel like self-sabotage, they feel like wisdom. That's what makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt. It doesn't come dressed as fear. It comes dressed as maturity, as caution, as self-awareness. And by the time you recognize what just happened, you're already 3 steps back from where you were, and the moment has closed. The Stoics had a name for this kind of internal movement, not a failure of will, not a weakness of character, a failure of perception. The inability to see clearly what is actually happening inside you versus what your mind is telling you is happening. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, "Words never meant to be published, never meant to perform, that the mind is not neutral. That it interprets, that it constructs, that every impulse to stop, to retreat, to reconsider then carries with it a story. And that story almost always feels true." What this video is about is not how to push through that story with more force. It's about learning to see the story for what it is, before it makes the decision for you. And to do that, you first need to understand something about the mechanism underneath. Because this pattern didn't start with this project or this goal or this version of your life. It started much earlier, in a system that was built not to help you grow, but to keep you alive. And that system is still running right now, probably without you noticing. What your nervous system learned about safety. There's a version of this conversation that goes straight to mindset, to beliefs, to habits, to the stories you tell yourself. And those things matter. But before any of that, before the psychology, before the philosophy, there's something more fundamental happening. Something that operates below the level of thought entirely. Your nervous system doesn't think. It responds. It was built over millions of years of evolution with one primary directive: keep you alive. Not happy, not fulfilled, not growing, alive. And the way it learned to do that was by cataloging experience, storing what felt safe, what felt dangerous, and creating automatic responses to keep you on the right side of that line. The problem is that this system doesn't distinguish between physical danger and psychological exposure, between a predator and a promotion, between a threat to your body and a threat to your identity. To the nervous system, visibility feels like vulnerability. Responsibility feels like weight that could crush you. The moment your life starts to expand beyond what it has known, that system interprets expansion itself as a signal to contract. And here's what makes this particularly difficult to see. The contraction doesn't feel like fear. Fear has a texture. You know it when it's there. This is different. This feels like fatigue, like sudden loss of interest, like a quiet but convincing sense that maybe this isn't the right time, that you need to think more, prepare more, wait for better conditions. Neuroscience calls this a threat response, the body's way of pulling back from the edge of the unknown. But the Stoics identified the same mechanism centuries before brain imaging existed, not as biology, but as a failure of judgment. The moment when what is familiar is confused with what is good. Epictetus was explicit about this. He didn't speak of fear as weakness. He spoke of it as misidentification, the error of treating discomfort as danger, of treating the unknown as the enemy, of treating the edge of your current identity as a wall, when it is actually a threshold. And this is where the distinction becomes critical, the one that most conversations about self-sabotage completely miss. There are two different fears operating in the human psyche when it comes to stopping before a breakthrough. The first is the fear of failure. That one is well documented, widely discussed, and most people have at least some conscious awareness of it. But the second one, the one that operates underneath, is the fear of advancement itself. The fear of what happens if it actually works. The fear of becoming someone you've never been before and losing the version of yourself that, for all its limitations, is at least familiar. These two fears have almost identical surface symptoms. Both produce hesitation. Both generate reasons to stop. Both feel from the inside like prudence, but they require completely different responses. And confusing one for the other is exactly how the pattern keeps repeating, because you keep solving the wrong problem. The question isn't why you're afraid to fail. The question is why part of you is afraid to arrive. The exact moment you stop. And what's actually happening there? There is a specific moment. And once you learn to recognize it, you'll start seeing it everywhere, in your past, in your present, and in time before it happens again. It's not the moment the project gets hard. Hard is something you've learned to handle. You've pushed through hard before. You know what hard feels like, and you know somewhere inside you that you can survive it. The moment is different. It arrives not when the path gets steeper, but when the path gets real. It's the moment when the change you've been working toward stops being hypothetical and becomes actual. When the discipline you've been building starts to produce visible results. When the project stops being something you're doing and starts being something you are. When other people begin to notice. When the stakes shift from internal to external. When continuing forward would require not just more effort, but a different version of you to do it. That's the moment, right there, because up until that point you were changing in private. The transformation was internal, protected, invisible. You could stop at any time and no one would know, including you in some important sense. But when results start to appear, when the thing becomes real, stopping is no longer neutral. It becomes visible. It becomes a statement. And moving forward becomes something else entirely. It becomes a commitment to a self you haven't fully inhabited yet. And that is what the nervous system doesn't know how to process, not the difficulty, the realness. Marcus Aurelius understood this in a way that most modern conversations about productivity completely ignore. He wrote about the obstacle not as something that appears when you're weak, but as something that appears precisely when you are becoming capable. Because capability creates exposure, and exposure to a system built for survival registers as risk. The most important thing to understand about this moment, the moment right before the breakthrough, is that it doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like clarity. The reasons to stop feel sharper than ever, more reasonable than ever, more mature than ever, and that's exactly how you know the pattern has activated. Not because reason is the enemy, but because this particular kind of reason arrives on schedule, always at the same point, always with the same quiet authority, always just convincing enough to make the pause feel justified, Think about the last time this happened to you. You don't have to search hard. There's probably one that comes to mind immediately. A moment where you slowed, then stopped, then told yourself a story about why stopping was the right move, and maybe it even felt true at the time. The question isn't whether the reasons were real. The question is, what were those reasons protecting you from? Because the answer to that question is where the actual pattern lives, and it's not where most people look. What Marcus Aurelius understood about the moment of retreta. The Stoics were not optimists. That's one of the most important things to understand about them before you try to apply their philosophy to anything real in your life. They didn't believe that things would work out. They didn't teach that positive thinking produces positive results. They didn't offer comfort. What they offered was something much harder to receive and much more useful. They offered a method for seeing clearly, for stripping away the layers of interpretation that the mind automatically adds to every experience, and looking at what is actually there. And what Marcus Aurelius saw, writing alone at night after days of governing an empire, after battles and losses and decisions that carried the weight of millions of lives, was that the mind is not a passive observer. It is an active constructor. It doesn't just receive experience, it builds a version of experience. It selects, frames, narrates, and concludes. And it does all of this so quickly, so seamlessly, that the construction feels indistinguishable from reality. He called this the faculty of impression, phantasia in the original Greek, the immediate mental image that arises the moment something happens. And he was unambiguous about its nature. The impression is not the truth, it is a representation, a rendering. And between the impression and the response there is a space, small, easy to miss, but real. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." That line is quoted endlessly, but its deepest meaning is almost always missed. He wasn't talking about attitude. He wasn't talking about staying positive in difficult circumstances. He was talking about something far more precise. The ability to catch the moment between what happens and what you decide it means. To pause inside that gap. To examine the impression before allowing it to become action. Applied to the pattern we're examining, the moment right before the breakthrough, this is what it looks like in practice. Something shifts internally. The reasons to stop begin to generate. The familiar atmosphere of retreat begins to form. And in that moment, the Stoic practice is not to push harder. It's not to override the feeling with discipline or willpower. It's to ask a single, precise question. Is this perception or is this reality? Is what I'm experiencing right now an accurate reading of what is actually in front of me? Or is it a rendering? A construction built from older material, from past experiences, from earlier losses, from a version of the world that may no longer apply? Epictetus put it this way, in the Discourses, the first task of anyone who wants to live freely is to examine their impressions. Not to trust them automatically, not to act on them without inspection, to hold them up to the light and ask whether they correspond to what is actually real. This is not easy. It requires a quality of attention that most people never develop, because most people are never taught that the mind constructs rather than simply reflects. They assume that what they feel is what is true, that what seems dangerous is dangerous, that what feels like the wrong moment is the wrong moment. But the pattern of stopping before the breakthrough is almost entirely built from impressions that were never examined, feelings treated as facts, interpretations treated as reality, a rendering of the situation produced automatically in milliseconds by a system calibrated for a different era, mistaken for clear seeing. And once you understand that, once you see the mechanism for what it is, something begins to shift, not immediately, not completely, but the pattern loses some of its invisibility, and what was automatic begins slowly to become a choice. Though the full weight of what that shift requires, and what it costs, is something the intellect alone cannot carry, the identity you haven't authorized yet, there's a contradiction that lives at the center of this pattern, and it's one that most people sense but never quite articulate clearly enough to do anything with. You want to change. That's not in question. The desire is real. The effort has been real. The intention, every time you started again, was real. And yet something keeps pulling you back to the same coordinates, the same approximate level of progress, the same approximate version of yourself, as if there's an invisible ceiling, not above your potential but around your identity. Carl Jung spent decades studying this particular human dynamic, not the fear of failure, that one was well understood long before him, but the fear of what he called the unlived life, the version of yourself that exists just beyond the threshold of your current self-concept. The capable, visible, expanded version that you can almost see, but haven't yet allowed yourself to become. Jung called the parts of ourselves we refuse to integrate the shadow. And most people understand the shadow as the dark side, the anger, the shame, the impulses we don't want to admit we have. But the shadow contains something else too, something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough. It also holds everything you haven't yet permitted yourself to be. The version of you that is taken seriously, that finishes what it starts, that operates at a level you've only observed in other people and told yourself was for other people. That version, the one that would emerge if you crossed the threshold you keep approaching and retreating from, that version lives in the shadow too. And the psyche, in its strange and ancient logic, treats that version with the same resistance it treats everything else in the shadow. Not because it's bad, but because it's unknown. Because integrating it would require dismantling something that is currently holding you together, the familiar story of who you are and what you're capable of. This is the part of self-sabotage that willpower cannot touch. Because willpower operates on the level of conscious decision. And what's happening here is happening one layer below that. It's the psyche protecting the coherence of your self-concept, even when that self-concept is the very thing limiting you. Think about what actually changes when you break through, not externally, internally. You can no longer claim the identity of someone who almost made it. You can no longer use potential as a shield. You can no longer live in the comfortable ambiguity of not yet, because you have crossed over. And the person on the other side of that threshold is not the same person who stood in front of it. That's not a metaphor. That is a real psychological death and rebirth. And the psyche, which is built for continuity, for coherence, for the preservation of a recognizable self, resists that transition with everything it has. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." But the deepest application of that line isn't about external obstacles, it's about this one. The resistance that lives exactly at the border of who you've been and who you're becoming. The question isn't whether you're capable of crossing it. You are. The question is whether you're willing to stop being who you've been long enough to find out who you become on the other side. And that question, quiet, uncomfortable, rarely asked directly, is the one that determines whether the pattern continues or finally breaks. But understanding it intellectually is only the beginning, because there's something that accumulates when the pattern repeats, something that doesn't stay abstract, something that settles into the body, into the self-image, into the way you talk to yourself in the quiet moments. And that accumulation, that weight, is what the next part of this is about, the real cost of stopping in the same place. There's something that happens the second time you stop in the same place. The first time it's a setback, something that happened, an event with a beginning and an end that you can set aside and move past. The story you tell yourself is reasonable. It wasn't the right time, you weren't ready, the conditions weren't right. And there's enough truth in that story to make it livable. The second time is different. The second time something quieter happens. Underneath the reasoning, underneath the new plan you're already building, underneath the renewed commitment to start again, something registers. Not loudly, not consciously most of the time, but it registers. And what it registers is this: you've been here before. You know how this ends. That's not a thought. It's a sediment, a layer that begins to form at the base of your self-perception. And each time the pattern repeats, each time you approach the same threshold and retreat from it again, that layer thickens, not dramatically, almost imperceptibly, but cumulatively. This is the cost that almost nobody talks about when they talk about self-sabotage. They talk about the missed opportunities, the projects that didn't get finished, the goals that kept getting reset. Those are real losses. But they are external. They are countable. You can look at them, name them, and in some cases even make up for them. What you cannot easily recover is what the repetition does to your relationship with yourself. Because every time you stop in the same place, a belief gets reinforced. Not stated, not decided. Reinforced. The way a path gets worn into the ground not by a single footstep, but by the same footstep taken hundreds of times in the same direction. And the belief worn in slowly over years is this. This is as far as I go, not as a declaration, as an assumption, as a background conviction that begins to color every new attempt before it even starts. The enthusiasm is real, but it carries a shadow. The commitment is genuine, but somewhere underneath it, a part of you is already preparing for the familiar outcome. Seneca wrote in his letters, "It is not that I am brave, it is that I know what is worth fearing." And the inversion of that applied here is devastating. The repeated pattern teaches you to fear the breakthrough itself, to unconsciously associate reaching that threshold with the pain of what followed the last time, and the time before that, until the approach itself begins to carry the weight of every previous retreat. This is why pushing harder doesn't work. You can increase the force, sharpen the discipline, build better systems, and still find yourself stopping in the same place. Because the issue isn't the effort. The issue is what effort runs into when it reaches that specific coordinate in your inner landscape. The man who stops at the same point every time isn't weak. He is responding with perfect consistency to something he learned, something that was written into him through repetition. And until that writing is examined, until the belief underneath the pattern is made visible, the pattern will continue to express itself with the same quiet, reliable precision. The question is not whether you can do more. You can. The question is what you actually believe, underneath the intention, underneath the plan, underneath the version of yourself that shows up motivated and ready, about what happens when you reach that place. Because that belief, more than any external obstacle, is what determines whether this time is different. And making it different, actually practically permanently different, starts not with more force but with a different quality of attention. One that the Stoics practice deliberately, one that can be learned where it actually starts, right now for real. Everything covered in this video, the nervous system, the identity threshold, the accumulated sediment of repeated retreat, can remain entirely intellectual, interesting, even moving, and still change nothing because the pattern doesn't live in understanding, it lives in the moment, the specific real-time moment when the internal atmosphere begins to shift, when the reasons start generating, when the familiar pull toward retreat begins to form, and you either see it or you don't. So this is where it becomes practical, not inspirational, practical. The Stoics had a practice called prosoche. It translates roughly as attention to oneself, but that translation doesn't carry the full weight of what they meant. They didn't mean self-reflection in the abstract. They didn't mean journaling or meditation or periodic review of your values. They meant a continuous, active, real-time quality of witnessing, watching yourself as you move through your life, noticing the impressions as they form before they become decisions. Applied to this pattern, prosoche looks like this. You learn to recognize your specific version of the retreat signal, not the generic description, your version, because it doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, it arrives as sudden fatigue. For others, as a burst of new ideas that redirect attention away from what was working. For others, as an intensified need to research more, prepare more, get more ready before continuing. For others still, as a quiet but growing conviction that the timing isn't right. You learn what yours looks like, and you learn to see it early, not after it's already made the decision, but in the moment it's forming. The second step is the one Marcus Aurelius returned to again and again throughout his meditations. The pause, not the suppression of the feeling, not the override, the pause. The deliberate insertion of space between the impression and the response. The moment in which you hold the signal up to the light and ask, with genuine curiosity, not judgment, what this is actually protecting me from, what it believes is about to happen, what it learned and when, and whether that learning still applies to who you are right now. That question alone, asked honestly in the moment, begins to dissolve the automaticity of the pattern. Not immediately, not completely, but it interrupts the mechanism. It introduces consciousness into a process that was previously running without it. The third step is the smallest possible forward movement. Not the heroic push, not the commitment to finish everything. The next smallest action that keeps you on the side of the threshold you want to be on. One sentence written, one message sent, one decision made that the retreating version of you would not have made. Not because small actions change everything, but because they change the evidence. They begin to rewrite, slowly through repetition, the same way the old pattern was written, what you know yourself to be capable of at that specific coordinate. This is not a quick process. The Stoics never promised quick. What they promised was that the quality of your attention determines the quality of your life. That the man who learns to see clearly, to catch the impression before it becomes fate, lives differently than the man who doesn't. Not because the world gives him more, but because he stops giving himself less. You've been close before, you know what that feels like. The question this video leaves you with is not whether you can get there again. You can. The question is whether, this time, you'll recognize the moment when it arrives and choose consciously to remain. And if you made it to the end of this video, something in it probably landed somewhere real, not just as an idea, as a recognition. So if this touched something you've been carrying quietly, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and leave a comment. I read every single one, because most of the time the next video starts there, in the experiences you share, in the things that are hard to put into words. And maybe the most important thing this channel exists to remind you of is this: the conflict you've been living with in silence, someone else is living it too. Right now, probably watching this. Thank you for your presence, for your attention, for the time you chose to spend here. See you in the next one.